Lady Death is the gripping memoir of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the most lethal female sniper in history. Dive into the harrowing and heroic account of a young Soviet woman who became a legend during World War II with 309 confirmed kills. Let's begin. On December 16th, we marked a festive occasion. At the command post of the 54th Regiment, situated in the Kamishli Gully by the village of the same name, the divisional commander, Major General Kolomiets, was to present government awards to 10 of my regimental comrades who had distinguished themselves in the defense of Odessa. I had returned from sniper duty in the forest quite late that day and immediately gone to bed. However, Lieutenant Dromov ordered me to go and congratulate the recipients on behalf of the 2nd Company. Also in attendance, apart from me, were representatives of our other detonated detachments, probably about 40 people in all. First to speak was Kolomiets. He said that our great homeland always recognized the feats of Red Army soldiers and officers, and he called on them to fight as bravely by the walls of Sevastopol as they had at Odessa. The next speaker was Regimental Commander Major Matusievich. He assured the general that the Razins would live up to the honor conferred upon them. Third to take the floor was appropriately the military commissar for our regiment, Battalion Commissar Maltsev. He talked about the Communist Party and young Communist League members who were setting an example of courage and staunchness in combat. Then came the presentation of awards. I witnessed in person the official award to the gallant machine gun company Sergeant Nina Onilova, who received the Order of the Red Banner. When my turn came, I addressed her with a speech befitting the occasion, albeit a very short one. It had been a clear, sunny day with a slight frost. The winter daylight was quickly coming to an end. Returning to the 2nd Company lines, I sat down on a fallen tree and lit up my pipe. It had been given to me by Anastas Vartanov after our successful attack on the village of Mekenzia, and was the only item of value he had left after the Germans destroyed his house. The old Turkish pipe, made from the root of a pear tree with an amber mouthpiece, had a most unusual appearance. It was also an award, but from an ordinary man. I easily learned how to use it, to pack it with tobacco correctly, smoke it unhurriedly, and maintain a slow glow of dried tobacco or paria fibers in the gleaming, polished bowl made of dark brown wood. It was pleasant to feel the warmth of the bowl in my hand. The mouthpiece seemed to moderate the strength of the smoke and prolong the pleasure for the smoker, which was unwittingly conducive to reflection. Since my officer comrades had been commemorating the battles for Odessa that day, my thoughts also returned to those recent events. We had come through our first lessons in the arduous and dangerous school of war and benefited much from the experience. We had matured, become smarter, hardened our characters, grown accustomed to looking death calmly in the eyes and skillfully deceiving her. Without such habits, you are not a real soldier. Could Nina Onilova and I be measured against each other in terms of enemies annihilated? At the staff headquarters of the 25th Rifle Division, she was credited with having sent 500 fascists to the next world. By the middle of December 1941, I had just over 200. The most important thing was that they were no longer fighting, trampling our land, and killing our compatriots. Perhaps the suddenness of their demise drove some sense into other invaders who had come here in the hope of a swift and easy conquest. "This is the first time I've seen a girl with a pipe," said a pleasant baritone voice behind me. I looked around. A junior lieutenant was approaching the fallen tree. I had seen him somewhere before, not in the 54th Regiment, but quite probably in the 287th or 31st. Prajuseas, which were also part of our division and had fought at Odessa. He was a big, statuesque, and broad-shouldered man with blue eyes and dark brown hair, about 35 years of age. He sat down beside me, took a cigarette case out of his overcoat pocket and opened it. It contained Kazbek brand cigarettes from the officers' rations. The junior lieutenant offered them to me. After hesitating, I took one. He also took one, then clicked his lighter, and we started smoking. "What do you use in your pipe?" the officer asked. "Shag tobacco." "Isn't it a bit strong?" "It is, but I've got used to it." "It's funny," he continued. "Good-looking women don't usually smoke pipes. In other words, I must be ugly and unusual." "The fact that you're unusual is well known to the entire 54th Regiment, Lyudmila Mikhailovna," he said respectfully, looking at me. "But the question of female looks is quite a complex one. Our ideal is dictated by time, fashion, and custom. For example, I consider you good-looking." In this first conversation of ours, he behaved in a restrained, courteous, and sensitive way. He introduced himself at once. "Kitsenko, Alexei Arkhizkedievich, from the city of Donetsk. Called up in 1941, he fought in the ranks of the 287th Regiment, had a technical education as an electrician, had been a sergeant, then a senior sergeant, and recently become an officer on November 30th of this year on completion of an accelerated course for the middle rank officer corps under the Coastal Army General Staff. His reason for making my acquaintance was quite simple. Kitsenko had been appointed commander of our second company, and now he was going around the battle formations to get to know people and study the fortifications he was tasked with defending. Alexei Arkadievich's speech was coherent, grammatically correct, and even quite witty. He concluded his narrative with a funny story about the final examinations on his officer's course. While assembling a TT pistol, his friend got so nervous that he lost one of the components. He put the gun together, but it could not be dismantled anymore and would not fire. After lengthy consultations, the commission came up with the verdict that he had passed the exam, his knowledge of his weapon was obvious, and the rest was beyond the commission's competence. In a word, Alexei made a good impression. I hoped that this would not evaporate in the course of further service together. I can add that men like him, big, well-proportioned, blue-eyed, and blonde-haired, generally appealed to me. Privately, I called them Vikings, the bold warriors of the far-off northern seas. How were we to know that on this quiet evening the invaders were completing preparations for a second assault on Sevastopol, moving up the last of 645 pieces of field ordnance and 252 items of anti-tank artillery? As well as that, they had already set out 378 mortar guns of various calibers behind no man's land, and now had 27 weapons per kilometer of front, while we had only 9. Over 200 bombers and fighters were about to attack the Soviet positions, while we had only 90 aircraft. Beyond the crests of the Mackenzie Hills, covered in bushy forest, 3 German infantry divisions, the 22nd, 24th, and 132nd were lining up in battle formation. They were preparing to strike at the junction between the 3rd and 4th sectors of the Sevastopol defenses, that is, on the narrow stretch from Mackenzie village to Aziz Oba Hill, in order to break through to the north side of the biggest bay in the Black Sea Fleet's principal naval base. If the Nazis reached its shores, then the city, being completely surrounded on the landward side, could not stand sea transport, and this remained the only way of draft reinforcements, military supplies, weapons, and provisions would then cease. The Fritzes unleashed a hail of artillery and mortar fire on the city's defense positions at 6:10 on the morning of December 17th, 1941. The earth shook. The crashing, wailing, and whistling of shells and mortars were deafening and seemed impossible to bear. Hidden in our deep earth refuges, we waited for the end of the cacophony. The ammunition of the enemy, even one as calculating as the Germans, could not be infinite. The artillery attack continued for about 20 minutes. Then the enemy infantry advanced across the entire front. Twin-engine Junkers and Heinkels appeared in the sky. They bombed not just the city, but the front line of the Soviet forces. I wrote about this after the war. The enemy now counted on inflicting its main blow in a different sector, from the Duvankoy district across the Belbek River Valley and the village of Kamishli to the northeast extremity of Northern Bay. The invaders intended to split the defensive front, to encircle the units of the 4th sector and come out at Sevastopol. The Nazis switched the main forces of their 11th Army to the district of Aziz Oba Hill, to the north of the Mackenzie Hills. As well as that, auxiliary reserves were gathering there to ensure the success of the military action. The enemy planned to conclude this operation in 4 days by December 21st. By using the natural features of the locality, Nazi submachine gunners managed to penetrate through to the rear of our defenses on some sectors of the front. They counted on encircling the Soviet units. The Nazi maneuver did not come off. Our destruction squads, consisting mainly of Communist Party and Young Communist League members, isolated the enemy movements. The enemy submachine gunners were surrounded and annihilated. The first day of the second assault was not a successful one for the Nazis. They lost 9 aircraft in aerial battles and from anti-aircraft fire. There were great losses of tanks and manpower too. The enemy came up against increasing resistance from rifle units and naval infantry detachments, which engaged them in heavy, prolonged fighting. Of the coastal army units, the soldiers of the artillery regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Bogdanov, fought with special distinction. They had earlier battled heroically for Odessa. The Bogdanov gunners always took up positions close to the forward line, and there were times when they had to beat off the attacks of the enemy infantry. At critical moments in major advances, Bogdanov himself would go out into no man's land and serve as a spotter for his own regiment. Fearlessness and courage were the gunners' main watchwords. The fighting proceeded not only on land, but also at sea. The sailors of the cruiser Krasny Krim fought courageously during these days under the command of Captain Second Class Zubkov. His crew, gunners, engineers, electricians, and torpedo personnel self-sacrificingly repelled the furious attacks of the Nazi bombers. This floating fortress covered the Soviet ships heading into Sevastopol Bay and trained destructive fire at the enemy infantry and vehicles. The ship's gunners did not know the meaning of the word fatigue. They inflicted lethal blows and shocked the foe with the suddenness of their attacks. Once, in the very heat of battle, an enemy shell exploded by the gun of Starshina, warrant officer, second class Mikhailenko. The commander of the weapon and some of the gun crew were wounded, but the firing continued. The sergeant major was replaced by a sailor. Despite the losses, the ship's artillery operated without a hitch. Many heroes of the Sevastopol defense were known in the city by name. One popular name was that of minesweeper captain Dmitry Andreyevich Glukov. His boat was the first to go out to deal with acoustic mines. They were very difficult to counter. These mines were called acoustic precisely because they would explode as a result of insignificant sound oscillations. With no fear of danger, Glukov's minesweeper would set about disarming them. This bold-spirited crew needed only a few hours to completely clear the approach routes for ships into the bay. I recall another feat of this team. A convoy of heavily loaded Soviet transport ships was heading for Sevastopol. Protection was provided by a chain of boats under Glukov's command. Nazi air reconnaissance discovered the ships and directed their bombers against them. Bombs whistled down, raising huge fountains of water. They tried many times to attack the transport ships, but the fire from our boats drove the planes away. The Soviet transports got to their destination unharmed. The glorious defenders of Sevastopol were inspired by the initial victories of the Soviet armies near Moscow, striving to downplay the significance of our victories and somehow restore the myth of their army's invincibility. The Nazi High Command set an objective for their forces at Sevastopol to capture the city regardless of the losses. The date laid down by the Nazis for entry into the city was December 21st. They wanted the capture of the city to coincide with the 6-month anniversary of war with the Soviet Union. The enemy were advancing. Sevastopol was placed in an extraordinarily difficult situation. The fate of its future defense was being decided. So, on December 20th, a message concerning the seriousness of the situation was sent to the Supreme Command headquarters. In the reply that followed 4 hours later, the commander of the Black Sea Fascist fleet was ordered to send to Sevastopol part of the naval infantry, some draft reinforcements, and shells. Within the military formations of the 25th Chapayev Division, the first day of the assault, December 17th, was particularly difficult for the soldiers and officers of the 287th Rifle Regiment, who were occupying positions by the Yaila Bash Hill and the southern extremity of the Kamishli Gully. Advancing against them was an infantry force of several battalions, supported by 10 tanks. Soon there was hand-to-hand combat in the trenches of the 5th Company of this regiment's 2nd Battalion. Junior political instructor Golubnichi distinguished himself here. He bayoneted 6 Nazis and continued in action, despite being wounded. However, by the middle of the day, the troops of the 287th Regiment were forced to retreat towards the village of Kamishli. At 5 o'clock in the evening, they were already 800 meters east of the village, while the 9th Company was completely encircled and heroically fighting off the attacks of the Nazi submachine gunners. By the end of the day, the regiment had withdrawn still further towards the northeast slopes of the Kamishli Gully. The soldiers of the 2nd Perikop Regiment of Naval Infantry, which was part of our division, also withstood a significant blow. Launching themselves in a bayonet attack, they stemmed the Fritzes' advance, but were gradually forced to withdraw and managed to establish themselves only on the western slopes of height full 264.1. They were assisted in getting away from the enemy by the gunners of the 69th Regiment, who wiped out 10 enemy tanks by direct fire from their 76 mm caliber ordnance. These ferocious clashes occurred approximately 1 kilometer to the left of the 54th Regiment's dispositions. The Razins also engaged in crossfire with the Nazis, but did not experience such desperate enemy pressure. True, a number of times the German infantry ranks ventured into no man's land, with Quavation, which had been cleared of bushes and trees. However, on encountering solid machine gun and rifle fire, backed up by mortars, they went to ground and then drew back. For 2 days, the cannon roared on the Mackenzie Hills. The Nazis were unable to overrun our front or achieve a definitive advantage over the defenders of Sevastopol. The Russians charged in counterattacks and won back their firing lines that had been occupied by the Germans. This concludes the 12th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Pavlichenko's story? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.